take inventory. We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people.
During 1981 to 1989, there were tensions of war between the United States and Russia, and the threat of communism spread throughout the world. There was one man America looked up to during this time. This man was Ronald Reagan. In his 1985 State of the Union address, President Reagan pledged his support for anti-communist revolutions in what would become known as the Reagan Doctrine. In 1980, war between Iraq and Iran broke out. The war would not end until 1988, when the UN would call for a ceasefire to end hostilities. During this time, however, while Iran and Iraq were at war, Iran made a secret request to buy weapons from the United States. Bud McFarlane, the National Security Advisor, sought Reagan's approval, in spite of the embargo against selling arms to Iran. He believed that the sale of arms would improve U.S. relations with Iran. However, Reagan was driven by a different obsession. He had become frustrated with his inability to secure the release of 7 American hostages being held by Iranian terrorists in Lebanon. Reagan formally and secretly approved of the Iran initiative on December 7, 1985, over the objections of both Secretary of State Shultz and Secretary of Defense Weinberger. The initiative was in fact underway before Reagan acted. In August and September, Israel had sent more than 500 American anti-tank missiles to Iran, which produced the release of 1 American hostage. Throughout 1986, another 1,000 American missiles were sent to Iran via Israel. As a result of the arms sale, a few more American hostages were released. The selling of the arms to Iran in exchange for hostages became known as the Iran Contract.
There was Cold War drama. We fought the commies inside Nicaragua. Our friends were the Contras. Freedom was their mantra, so we sent them lots of money for guns and landmines. But Congress stopped the Contra money flow just 'cause they moved a teeny bit of blow. But then a hero came forth. His name was Oliver North. He and Reagan went around the sissy Congress. All in North, all in North. You see, North secretly sold missiles to a harmless country called Iran that would always be a grateful ally. Then he gave the profits to the Contras. Genius! But the sales were uncovered by the press. Reagan and North began to stress. 'Cause what they did was technically high treason. But it was totally justified. North volunteered to take the blame to save Reagan from prison rape's shame. The truth he did bury with his hot secretary, thanks to her shredder. He got off totally scot-free. All in North, all in North. He's a soldier and a hero and a novelist, and now he's on Fox News.
News about the Contras later broke out in a Lebanese magazine and soon made its way over to American headlines.
My fellow Americans, I've said on several occasions that I wouldn't comment about the recent congressional hearings on the Iran-Contra matter until the hearings were over. Well, that time has come, so tonight I want to talk about some of the lessons we've learned. But rest assured, that's not my sole subject this evening. I also want to talk about the future and getting on with things because the people's business is waiting. These past 9 months have been confusing and painful ones for the country. I know you have doubts in your own minds about what happened in this whole episode. What I hope is, not in doubt, however, is my commitment to the investigations themselves. So far, we've had 4 investigations by the Justice Department, the Tower Board, the Independent Counsel, and the Congress. I requested 3 of those investigations, and I endorsed and cooperated fully with the 4th, the congressional hearings, supplying over 250,000 pages of White House documents, including parts of my own private diaries. Once I realized I hadn't been fully informed, I sought to find the answers. Some of the answers I don't like. As the Tower Board reported, and as I said last March, our original initiative rapidly got all tangled up in the sale of arms, and the sale of arms got tangled up with hostages. Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger both predicted that the American people would immediately assume this whole plan was an arms for hostages deal and nothing more. Well, unfortunately, their predictions were right. As I said to you in March, I let my preoccupation with the hostages intrude into areas where it didn't belong. The image, the reality.
Reagan supported the anti-communist movement in Guatemala. This is due to the effects of poor human rights records of the rebels and the democratic transition of power. Reagan would provide Latin America with military support and financial aid. U.S.-Latin American relations was renewed on the East-West conflict and the attention to so-called North-South questions such as development help and demand for changes in the economic relations of developed and developing countries, which is summarized in the new International Economic Order. Reagan was able to successfully provide Latin America with help.
Reagan also tried to stop communism at the source in the Soviet Union. After Chernenko, the leader of the Communist Party, died in 1985, a young political figure would take control of the Communist Party. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. The reforms Gorbachev suggested for the Soviet Union were his system of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost sought to ease the strict social controls imposed by the government. Perestroika, his reconstructing concept, started with an overhaul of the top members of the Communist Party. It focused on economic issues and replacing the centralized government with a greater reliance on market forces. Gorbachev's internal reforms were matched with new approaches to the Soviet foreign policy. Determined to end his country's nuclear rivalry with the United States, he negotiated with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev took part in 5 summits between 1985 and 1988. Their discussions resulted in the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, which brought about a major reduction in both nations' weapons stockpiles. This progress brought on many points, which began with Gorbachev's willingness to abandon the long-held Soviet positions. This is a significant turning point in tensions between the United States and Russia. These meetings between the two resulted in the slowing of the arms race. This showed promise that the Cold War was ending. Ronald Reagan insistently told Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall.
Tear down this wall.
The Cold War and the arms race negatively affected the Soviet economy, and U.S. influence would eventually lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. Since the two countries carried much of the confrontational burden, both Russia and the United States ended up with substantial economic liabilities. However, the Soviet Union could not function with such economic liabilities. Reagan fought communism in Central America and throughout the world. However, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. The collapse of the Soviet Union would not only end the Cold War and the arms race, it would also end communist influence in the Middle East, Central America, and throughout the world. With this, the democratic and communist halves of Germany would no longer exist, ending one of the most iconic symbols of the Cold War, communism, and the Soviet Union. This symbol shows what the world could have been, and that with the help of Ronald Reagan, democracy prevailed.